All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Kyle Hope. I'm going to give it a few more minutes to let a few more people flood in. Hopefully, you guys all got, well, the ones who are in now got the updated registration URL. We had a little bit of a hiccup yesterday. We are human, but hopefully we got everyone who signed up in the first place. But thank you for joining on the new link. So let's just give it another minute or two, and then we'll jump in. All right, so I will get started. So thanks again for everyone who's attending today in the webinar. This is a presentation that I did in IEX at Amsterdam a couple weeks ago. Figured it was a good topic and one that a lot of folks in the industry need to be aware of. So we decided as a team to put this little webinar together. And how we'll go about it is it'll be about approximately 20 minutes, maybe in length for the actual presentation itself, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for a Q&A if anyone's got any questions, and we can go forward from there. But I am Kyle Hope, and I am the Director of Partnerships and Supply at Quest Mindshare. So today we're going to cover cracking the code on survey engagement, a user experience-driven approach. So really what we wanted to look at here was we wanted to have a brutally honest conversation about online surveys, and not just from the perspective of us as researchers, but really from the people who are on the other side of the screen who participate in our research studies. So the Cambridge Core published that 82% of survey results contain fraudulent user data or bogus feedback. So we've all heard stats like this before, and whether you think this stat is on the higher end or the lower end, I think there's one thing we can all agree upon, in that data quality is an issue, especially fraud. But here's the twist. What if fraud isn't the biggest problem that we face? What if our biggest problem isn't fake respondents, it's real ones quitting for real reasons? So we set out to understand how many data quality issues can stem from low quality or disengaged respondents. And how does the user experience factor into the fraud problem that we see in online research today? But what we found is arguably more concerning than outright fraud. It was real people dropping out, disengaging, and not coming back. They weren't bots, they weren't speeders, they were legitimate respondents showing us legitimate frustration. So we wanted to understand their frustration. So what did we do? Well, we did what market researchers do. We ran a survey. And this is just covering the scope of what our research study that we conducted in the methodology, but we started and surveyed just approximately over 1,700 respondents in the US. It was balanced to reflect census representation. We partnered with multiple vetted panels to reduce any single source bias. We didn't want to focus just on our panel alone. We wanted to use multiple sources. We then ran the survey over 2 weeks, and we wanted to include weekends and multiple devices because we really just wanted to mimic what real world behavior is like from a research perspective of a respondent. And what emerged were 4 clear friction points that consistently showed up in the data. So that's where we're heading next. And what did we find? Well, across all demos, devices, the 4 friction points came up again and again. And the first one, before incentives, before length, and before user experience, is the most fundamental, and that is just getting in. So this is where most frustration begins from the respondent's perspective and where, unfortunately, many surveys end. The industry calls it screening and respondents call it rejection. And who likes rejection? So when we looked at survey qualification, we saw that 38 respondents cited it as being the biggest problem in online surveys today. But when we dug a bit deeper, we saw that it was not a one-size-fits-all frustration. And that will be a common theme in the presentation here today. But when we looked at qualification, we saw that women had a higher level of frustration than males, with about 41% citing qualification as their top concern. Among the 55 and up audience, that figure jumped to 43%. And then when we looked at the least affected group amongst the different demographics with regards to age, the 18 to 24-year-olds, it's still ranked as their second highest, biggest complaint. So the message respondents are hearing is, we wanted your time, just not your input. And, when you hear that enough times, you stop showing up. When you get rejected enough, you just give up. So that is a huge frustration point when it comes to respondents who participate in online surveys. In all the data we collected, this was the top one that emerged several times. So it's one we need to focus on as an industry and one we need to be really aware of when we run our studies, especially when we're trying to optimize user experience and minimize data quality issues. But when we go further past qualification and we say, we assume that someone qualifies, we then, move on to what is the next tension point that we saw in the data that we collected, and that is time versus value. So let's talk about incentives. So once a respondent qualifies, the next question becomes, is it worth it? And this is essentially the economics of engagement. Sorry, my computer froze a little bit there. So when we looked at incentives and we looked in the data, the answer was no, it wasn't worth it for nearly a quarter of respondents. The reward just didn't match the time or the effort. We heard feedback like pennies for 20 minutes, and that was a quote that was both literal and symbolic. Compensation isn't just a reward, it's a signal of how much we value the respondent's time. And what's even more telling is who's the most vocal about this. Respondents in the 35 to 54 age group, we saw that nearly a third of them named incentives as their top frustration. So these are people who are trying to balance work, family, time, and pressure, something that I can certainly relate to. But if they feel undercompensated, they're going to disengage pretty quickly. And, we know incentives are a cost to panel companies, to research companies, but they're also communication when we look at incentives. A poor reward says to respondents, your time isn't worth much. A thoughtful one says, we value your time. So, when we look at how we value the respondents, we're essentially the lifeblood of the industry. When we look to capture insights and make data-driven decisions, we really need to start to think about the respondent and not just the bottom line from, the business perspective when we're running our company or our research studies. But, even when the right reward's on the table, we then start to move on to what our next friction point is. And that shows up pretty quickly. And that's going to be, how long is this survey going to take me? So let's talk about survey length. So let's say someone qualifies and, reward feels fair enough to keep them going. The next question on their mind isn't always spoken, but it's certainly felt. And that is, how long is this going to take me? Because time, more than money, can be the currency in trust in online surveys today. So what the data showed us that, with regards to survey length, there is a clear preference for brevity. 68% of respondents prefer surveys that are 10 minutes or less, and more than a half said their ideal length is somewhere between that 5 to 10 minute mark. So we've been able to determine that the Goldilocks zone or sweet spot with regards to survey length sits somewhere between that 5 to 10 minute LOI. And now I know the averages typically across the industry fall in that 12 to 15 minute length. We really saw that there is much more a preference to 5 to 10 minutes. And, that kind of coincides with how we as consumers consume research or consume media today. And, that tends to fall in line with where we see how consumers are in the current landscape. So, we were able to find that in our data, and I think that rings true going forward in the future with regards to survey length. But when we go a little bit further and we start to say, what are the different nuances between different age groups, we start to see that there are some preferences amongst different demographic segments. We saw when we looked at just survey length tolerance in general that only 22% of respondents cited survey length as their biggest pain point in online surveys. But when we segment the data out, we can see again that length tolerance is not a one-size-fits-all approach. The 18 to 24-year-olds, what we've called the TikTok generation, showed the highest preference for surveys under 5 minutes. They also highlighted survey length as their biggest pain point, with about 41% of respondents showing frustration with survey length. So this is a generation that's heavily invested in content that's fast, clear, skippable. They'll give you 5 minutes, but you really got to earn it. But when we start to look at older audiences, we can see that, patience grows a bit with age when it comes to survey length. And the other piece, about survey length is it doesn't just affect dropout when the respondents in the survey, it does affect trust. So when we tell respondents we're running a 5-minute survey and we deliver it in 15, we start to break that experience. And the other takeaway here is really, when we look at the differences between different demographic segments, you need to start looking and factoring this into how you plan your research in the planning phase, because if you're running a 30-minute long survey and you're really trying to target 18 to 24-year-olds, you need to understand the issues that are going to arise with running a 30-minute study with 18 to 24-year-olds. And as we've seen in previous research on research studies about data degradation, you're going to get lower quality data if you're running 30-minute long surveys with that particular demographic segment. Whereas, if you want to run a 30-minute study and your audience is, an older demographic segment, 55 and up, retirees, you probably have a little bit more patience from the respondent. But, here's the thing. Survey length isn't the full story on its own. It's not the only pain point that respondents cited as being, a big issue with online surveys today, because even short surveys can feel long when the user experience gets in the way. So when we asked respondents about their biggest frustrations with online surveys, only 16% of respondents cited a poor UX directly as their biggest frustration. And, that might seem like a small number, but what a lot of them described hits pretty hard. And that was small fonts, endless grids, loops, bad layouts, confusion. User experience problems don't always get named first, but they're felt in every click, every delay, and every dropout. And in a digital environment, user experience is a silent killer of engagement. A great UX can make a long survey feel short. A bad one can make a short survey feel unbearable. And user experience doesn't compete with the other pain points. We find that it tends to amplify them. So when the user experience isn't great, the incentive's not good, it's a long survey, it really just makes the frustration amplified from the respondent's perspective. And that's what we saw in the data that we collected. So we've now covered the 4 big friction points, and all from the respondent's perspective. And in summary, those are qualification, am I going to get in? Incentives, is it worth my time? Survey length, will this take too long? And respondent UX, can I even get through this thing? But here's the thing. These pain points don't live in isolation. We have to treat the entire experience from invite to exit as a connected journey. So what that means is we need to start look at designing the experience and not just the survey itself. So in this slide, I stacked kind of all the recommendations or best practices into one slide, just so the audience maybe has something to take away. They can screenshot it or they can get a copy of the deck potentially afterwards. But in the instance of time, I wanted to stack this all on one slide just to get through it fairly quickly. But what I'll do is I'll briefly touch on each point with regards to the 4 friction points. So let's start where all the pain points converge, and that is the user experience. So when I talk about user experience for this presentation, we're typically talking about the design and the flow of a survey. When I talk about survey experience in general or user experience in general, it's typically kind of a holistic view of all of this together. But for the sake of some of the best practices, we'll start with just kind of the design aspect of research studies and surveys. So, when we start with user experience from a design standpoint, we need to have mobile at the forefront of our design strategy. Everyone's shifting a lot more use to their smartphones. So many people do not even own laptops or desktop computers anymore. So we need to cater how we design our surveys to have mobile at the forefront. We also need the design to be intuitive. It needs to have readability, and it needs to have a smooth flow to it. A bad UX doesn't just cause friction. Again, it can amplify it. We then need to look at survey length and rethink how we plan and build our research studies out based on survey length. And less is often more, at least as it relates to data quality. So we need to try and stay within that sweet spot or that Goldilocks zone whenever possible. We also need to consider the option of modular surveys. And for anyone who's not familiar with modular surveys, that is taking maybe, say, a 15-minute survey and breaking it out into 3 5-minute surveys. And maybe you've got a sample size of 500 for that 15-minute study. You now look at expanding that out to maybe 1,000 or 1,500. And that's what we talk about with looking at survey length differently, is potentially looking at more modern ways of hosting your survey and planning it, looking to the future respondent as opposed to one from the 2000s. We also want to make sure we match the LOI to our target audience. So like I mentioned earlier, younger audiences need brevity. Older audience have a higher tolerance for survey length. So just understand those different nuances when you're planning some of your research study. If it's purely a Gen Pop study that has 18 and up across the entire US, well, you may not have the nuance there to target specific segments within your study, but you need to understand that if, say, you're targeting 18 to 24-year-olds, or you've got a study that's targeting 45, 55 and up audience. We'll then move on to incentives. So this is what is the value proposition, the incentive. We need to make sure that we're aligning our expectations with rewards. We also need to consider different methods of how we incentivize respondents, whether that's a pay per question block or a partial complete payment, or even cost per start. I've heard a couple different ideas float around with regards to paying out incentives for partial completes or question blocks or cost per start. I'm not a fan of all of them. I tend to kind of favor the pay per question block from the perspective of, if you've got high quality respondents and verified respondents, that there may be some interest in doing that in the future, just to keep respondents more engaged and happy. But I think just in general, we need to look at incentives differently than we currently do today, which also means better incentives. So, when we look at incentives, they're more than just payments. They are signals to how much we value the respondent. So we then go on to our final hurdle, which is qualification. And there's a lot that can be said about how we can optimize qualification, but for this presentation, I'll focus on 2 areas of emphasis that I want to touch on, and that is the length of screening and leveraging pre-profiled data. So if we're going to screen respondents out or reject them as they see it, we need to do so within a timely manner. We cannot be screening respondents out after 5 or 10 minutes. And we should certainly not be asking further questions of the respondent after they've failed the screening criteria. And I've tested hundreds and hundreds of surveys where I know the screening criteria, and in question 3, I've intentionally screened out, but I find myself at question 15 still answering questions. So when we do that with respondents, they may not always know the targeting criteria, but when we have them running through 5-10 minute screening processes where they're ultimately not qualifying, that starts to break the trust with the respondent. And then the other area of emphasis with regards to screening that I'll focus on is leveraging pre-profiled data. So I think that, like, how is it in 2025 that we append pre-profiled data into surveys instead of asking the respondent the same demographic questions time and time again? And I get it. We can already do so today with a lot of the tools out there by leveraging and appending data variables into survey URLs. But we tend to always ask the same demographic questions. And I know most researchers want to have that in their primary data collection. But from the respondent's perspective, answering these questions multiple times, always the same questions, when this has actually been profiled, in their sign up stage, or however they're being targeted, there's frustration there. And in a lot of the open ends, we did see that respondents were citing, why are you asking me the same demographic questions 50 times in all these surveys when I've answered it in my profile? And, I get it. We do that because, fraud is an issue in the industry today. But we can't let fear dictate how we design our research studies. I think there's other ways we can combat fraud and make the user experience better. And I think leveraging pre-profiled data better across the board in the industry is a better way of doing it. It just shortens the length of the survey, makes the user experience a bit better. So I really think that as an industry, we need to start looking at making that more an industry standard, as opposed to just, always asking the same demographic questions, and instead of leveraging on pre-profiled data, whether that's appending it into a survey or, post field work appends. There's a bunch of different ways we can do it, but I think we really got to start to focus on how do we make this user experience better. Because, one of the reasons why fraud is as prevalent as it is in the industry today is because, quite frankly, only fraudsters are willing to endure the survey experience. I've tested so many surveys that are, the worst user experience you could imagine. And I work in the industry and I have to grin my teeth and bear through it. You can only imagine how someone outside of the industry, or someone who's not trying to game the system, is feeling about taking some of these surveys. So, part of my belief from a data quality standpoint is that a lot of this is kind of been our own doing with how we've run our research studies. So again, this kind of looks more at the root cause instead of the symptoms of bad data quality. And that's where I think the user experience plays in. But, as we start to wrap this presentation up a bit further, I want to again emphasize the one size does not fit all when it comes to survey design. There is a lot of nuance when it comes to different audiences we're trying to target, different preferences amongst different audiences. We need to take a more agile approach with how we design our research. And in a day and age when content and marketing material is hyper personalized, I'd like to think as market researchers, we can kind of get to the same point when we start to look at more personalization than just running the standard, tracker or study that we've run for 20, 30 years and haven't had many changes other than a few questions or wording changes. I then think, I look at the general population, and if you assume that 1 or 2% of the general population participate in online surveys, I can't help but wonder, how do we get that number to 3, 4, or 5%? And I think the answer lies within the user experience. If we can make the whole user experience better, whether that's incentives, just shorter surveys, more access, and more mobile-friendly surveys and questionnaire design, I think we can start to tackle some of the quality issues that we have today if we look within, as instead of looking out at fraud and pointing the finger there. I think we can start to look at and see, what are things we can do better as researchers to make the user experience better, to make the data quality better? And ultimately, I think that answer lies within the user experience. And on a final note, this is my belief on how we need to start looking at the user experience and respondents. We need to start treating them like people and not just data points. So thank you guys for joining today. That is it in terms of the presentation. We've got a short Q&A afterwards. If anyone has any questions, wants my opinion on things, we're here, and the floor is open if you've got a question.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A or in the chat, but hi everyone, it's Mo from the marketing department at Quest Mindshare. I do have some questions from the presentation that you did at IIEX. If that was good, I could ask you some of those.
Sure.
One that strikes me as probably super relevant to what you were just talking about is about the greatest issue in online market research today. You mentioned data quality and fraud, and obviously this whole presentation is on user experience. So do you think the emergence of AI is one of the biggest issues, or is it the user experience or something else?
I think data quality, AI, and survey user experience all factor into some of the issues today. But again, if you look at the root cause of what some of the data quality issues are today, is that there's a limited pool of respondents that we can tap into. And if we can expand that pool of respondents, we can dilute some of the quality issues that we see today. It's not going to, erase all of the quality issues and fraudulent issues that we do see today. But again, if we make the user experience better and if we can, 2x or 3x the available pool of respondents, I think in general, we're going to see much higher data quality. And there are tools that we can use from a technology standpoint that can be leveraged to combat fraud and AI. And I think those will still, be important of how we run research in the future. But again, I look at, friends outside of the industry that, I talk to and tell them what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I ask them about participating in online surveys, and most of them have either tried it and realized there's no actual compensation or incentives involved in it unless you do hundreds and hundreds of surveys. The other folks haven't even tried it. They haven't even taken an online survey. So my big question is then, how can we expand the pool of respondents that we look at to tap into? How can we make the user experience better so that, quality isn't at the forefront of every discussion we have because of fraud? We're really
Right.
looking at, smaller numbers than we see today. And again, I think a lot of the quality issues we see is because some of the user experience is just so negative that, again, only fraudulent respondents are willing to go through it.
Okay. Here's another really good question, great question, that sort of the other perspective, the client's perspective. So some of my clients traditionally run 25 to 30-minute surveys. How can I convince them or get them to consider running shorter surveys?
Yeah, I mean, we've got white papers and blog posts that we've done on data degradation, and data degradation is real, especially after the 12 to 15-minute mark of a survey. There are ways you can combat that, and I've seen some folks out in the industry who are doing more conversational question styles, like a chatbot almost. There's a bunch of different ways you can kind of make that experience better for longer surveys, but 20 to 25-minute surveys are going to see some data degradation at some point. So how I would sell this to clients who consistently run 20 to 25-minute surveys is, what is a good to have and what is a need to have? So should we be having all the, nice to have questions in there, or do we really want to focus on the bulk and the meat of the research in the area we're trying to collect insights on, instead of, potentially creating, bad quality data by just running a longer survey? It's, you're going to have much more higher quality responses in a shorter survey than you are in a longer one. So I think, when we talk about how do we get clients to shift their mindset towards shorter surveys, I think you really got to double down on the quality aspect of it. And that to me is a big one because, again, quality is an issue today in the industry. There's a lot that's tied to fraud, and there's a lot that's tied just to bad user experience. So if we can start to really focus on what are the questions that we need to have, what is the areas and the data points we need to have versus what's nice to have, then we can kind of refine it down to what exactly makes the most sense, and how can we find ourselves in that, like, ideally in the 5 to 10-minute LOI mark, but potentially in the 10 to 15-minute.
Yeah, and that speaks a little to Dana Simpson's question that I see posted here. Thank you for that, Dana. Do you have recommendations for reaching out to engage Gen Z for surveys? Email seems to fall flat and skews older for older responses. Skews older for responses. Anything for that, Kyle, that you can say?
Well, I mean, response rates vary just like some of the preferences for surveys vary. You're more likely to get higher click rates on, text, whether that's through SMS or like through WhatsApp or just sending texts in. Members app and portals tend to be higher with the Gen Z audience. Emails, not always the case. That's usually an older demographic segment we see where they tend to have higher click-through rates on emails, but it comes down to also recruitment. So different areas of recruitment, if you're just trying to target and recruitment a Gen Pop audience to join a panel, well, you can probably advertise across the board. Whereas if you're trying to get a specific audience like Gen Zers, well, look at the types of media that they consume and how you can intercept them in between some of those points. So get like we dubbed them the TikTok generation. So maybe running TikTok ads maybe is a good way to recruit them. But with regards to response rates, I think you have to look at what the preferences are of the target audience you're looking at and what are things that they value. And for 18 to 24-year-olds, they want, fast content. They want it to be available at the fingertip. They don't typically like to talk to people on the phone. They tend to like to be, siloed out into their smartphone. So you've got to meet them at the areas that they frequent the most. And typically that's on their smartphone and apps. And hopefully in the future, we've got other ways of integrating into some of the social media platforms more to have like a better workflow as opposed to, just running an ad and targeting them through there. But again, meet them where they are and cater your email invite, if it's email or whatever form of invite you're looking to do towards a specific audience you want, and you should start to see a bit more success. It's similar to like some of the stuff we're seeing in the ad space today, is everything's getting hyper personalized. So instead of just running a newsletter or a single email ad campaign or email campaign, you're just sending the one generic version of it out to your entire customer base or audience. The ability to scale hyper personalized content is now coming with AI and is already here. So I think that's where we want to start to get very personalized so we can start to get higher conversion rates, higher click-through rates, and we should start to see better success in those areas going forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, segments are really interesting. I have one on North America and European respondents, but I do see another question here in the meeting chat. Thanks, Lucia, for mentioning that to me. So, Alketa, thank you for your question. Hi, Kyle. Most of barriers and recommendations on how to improve respondent engagement apply to both B2B and B2C audiences. However, with B2B being more difficult to reach, how do you have any additional suggestions on how to engage them more often for a longer survey?
Yeah, so we've seen this actually. Scott Worthgy and I ran a previous presentation on just from like a B2B respondents perspective, and what we did see is there are some differences and things and what they value in terms of incentives. So business professionals tend to have a higher preference towards non-monetary compensation in the form of an incentive. So that may be having access to the data that you're actually running the study on, providing them access to the research report, giving them a free trial of a certain software or product. You need to think about what are ways in which they can excel as a professional in the B2B space and start to try and craft incentives that are, not necessarily out of the box, but different from just issuing a gift card. And we saw that donations was higher amongst giving out, charitable donations was higher amongst B2B audiences. We saw there was a preference for industry publications, best practices, training material, a lot of stuff that, catered more towards building their career and their profession, as opposed to just saying, hey, take this 15-minute survey and we'll give you a $25 gift card. It's there's a bit more different nuance to come when it comes to incentives. And then with regards to like survey length, you're probably going to be running into more busier professionals who are taking these surveys. So again, try to follow best practices with survey length and with qualifications so that you're not making the whole process very painful for them. If you can get them in 10 to 15 minutes and collect the data that you need, that's great, but you're not going to find directors, C-level executives spending 30 to 45 minutes taking an online survey that's got multiple grids and just has a horrible experience from the get-go, unless they've got, something really compelling to make them participate.
Right. I mean, incentives, as you mentioned, really a trust signal. But how do we set the right value across, different audiences? Anything that you can say to help with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a universal number. Um, Rule of thumb would probably be like rewards should reflect the effort. So again, we saw that in our data. We saw the 45 to 54-year-old age group was very sensitive to low compensation, and that's likely due to their time being under pressure. And younger audiences care about survey length more than payout. So it's not just always pay more. It's about aligning kind of the experience and the value for each segment. So you can do different tiered models. We can look at partial rewards or loyalty based incentives that all kind of help close the gap. Again, this is all not a one size fits all approach. If you're running a Gen Pop study, what I would suggest is take some of the best practices and understand that you may not be able to get to the nuance that applies to each demographic segment, but be mindful of what are the pain points that we see in online surveys today and think about how we can design our questionnaire to combat some of the issues that we can't control, which is, if you can't make a Gen Pop study for 18 and up, shorter for 18 to 24-year-olds and longer for 55 and up. But what you can understand is that if it's got a mobile first, design to it, if it's intuitive, if it's got good flow, that's just going to be a best practice across the board. So that's what I would take from it is understand what are the areas that you can improve your research design. And if you've got a specific target audience you're looking at, take some of the, recommendations we have and cater your research survey or questionnaire design towards that audience specifically.
Right. And I think that's what Hemendra in the Q&A channel here is saying, the usual grid type, drop down type, multi-select questions. Should these all be changed and designed in a more visual way, in an engaging, interesting way to reduce respondent fatigue? And I guess there the answer is yes. Do we anticipate this to impact the data being collected in a negative way? If you see
Yeah,
that there.
I mean, with like running grid questions, I don't think we'll ever do away with them necessarily. I think there's better ways that we can do it. So first of all, just don't have giant grids. That's a big no-no. If you've tested a survey with a ton of grid questions, it's not pleasing to go through it all. It's not enjoyable. So try to avoid how big you're running these grid style questions. The other piece is we're not quite there in terms of some of the mobile friendly design aspects that I've seen. Like a lot of the programming and hosting platforms for surveys they're pretty decent. I wouldn't say that they're not great though. I think if we really started to look at not gamifying or gamification of a survey, but just kind of making it more visually appealing. And if I've run through multiple platforms on a mobile device. They all don't look horrible, but they certainly don't look great. I think you could make grid questions alongside just the overall survey in general on some of these platforms just better functionality on a mobile device. I look at like, having the ability to swipe left, swipe right, taking something out of the Tinder playbook, but how you answer questions and whether that's, looking at like taking a max diff or a conjoint and building in some of the functionality that we have in different mobile apps and making it, more engaging from the respondent's perspective, where instead of, having to zoom in on the text you can barely see on a mobile, you can, see a graphic and you can swipe up, you can swipe left, whatever it may be. I think there's a lot of cool ways we could take it in the future, but I haven't personally seen a ton of it yet, at least adopted across the industry.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Kyle. We're almost at the 40-minute mark here. Almost everyone has stayed till the end, so thank you everyone for staying. I wanted to ask one last question, and then if anyone had anything, you can always get in touch with any of us here at Quest Mindshare. But one last, let's say a client runs a lot of long trackers. What are some practical ways to shorten surveys? which you touched on a little bit in terms of those segmented surveys in your presentation. But what are some practical ways to shorten surveys without losing the richness of the data? Because I suspect that's something that would happen, that could happen.
Yeah, modular surveys is potentially one way to do it, but I think we then, like I mentioned earlier, we start by separating what is nice to know versus what do we need to know. So a lot of these long trackers carry legacy questions forward just because they've always been there. If we then modularize it, can some questions move to follow-ups or separate pulses? Can we also leverage existing data where you can? If you already know the brand usage or the demographics, don't always ask it again. Modular surveys is a way of potentially taking a long tracker and breaking it down into smaller pieces and chunks that's more digestible. But yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the problem that we see with a lot of researchers today is that they've got a long-standing tracker that's run 25, 30 minutes that they don't want to have to change. And as much as I understand that point of view, I also think that, at what cost are you causing issues with data quality in the audience you're trying to reach? If you're continually running a survey that was, created in 2003 and you're just running that forward because of history, again, I understand it, but I think what you're going to start to see is quality will fall off a little bit towards the end. So these longer surveys, you've collected a ton of data, but everything past the 15-minute mark was you're going to have lower quality data. And when you're starting to use, if you've stacked some of your important need to know questions past that mark, well, now you're suffering lower data quality at the risk of just collecting all this data for a 25 or 30-minute survey.
Everything is need to know, Kyle. We need to know everything. That's what researchers want.
Oh, when you look at enough questionnaires that I have, that's not necessarily the case.
All right. We hope someone disagrees and writes to Kyle so he can hash it out with you. Once again, thank you everyone for coming, for your questions. If you had anything additional, please feel free to reach out to us. And that's my closing remark. Did you have one, Kyle?
Nope. Just thanks
Okay.
to everyone for attending. We'll be running more of these in the future, more research on research. And yeah, hopefully you stay tuned and follow us on LinkedIn. And, if you've got any sort of research needs, hit us up, reach out.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.